Welcome, Nura, to the Thank Goddess podcast. I am so excited to have you here. I am personally an astrology geek, so I love talking anything astrology, and I'm excited to kind of pick your brain because I know you have a lot of knowledge. I've been following you for some time now, and I felt like you would be such a good fit for this podcast because we talk so much on the divine feminine, and I have done a few episodes on astrology, although the focus isn't on astrology for this podcast. So I want to say my listeners are more beginner level. Um, but I love how you kind of integrate the feminine into your astrology readings and interpretations. That's what I've kind of noticed about you since following you. And today we have an exciting topic talking about how we can use astrology to connect to our unique feminine essence, which I'm so excited to dive into. But before we do that, I would love to learn a little bit about you for my listeners that don't know who you are. If you could maybe tell us a little bit about your background, how you came to astrology, and I guess how it's blossomed into the work that you do today.
Absolutely. Yes, these are all my favorite topics. And I can definitely say that the theme of sovereignty has actually been the thread for me from the beginnings of my astrology journey. And even before that, I had a totally different life plan. I never planned to be an astrologer. It really just found me. I think, as many of our healing modalities kind of
Mhm.
find us when we're ready for them, when we need them. And I remember I was doing my master's, it was in global development, and my thesis was on global food movements and sovereignty. So that was already a big theme for me. And I remember feeling really quite depressed, actually, pretty disillusioned by the inefficacy of systems that we live in. And I've always had this desire to serve, to help, to heal. I have a South Node in Virgo. For those of you who
Mhm.
know, that's an archetype of really wanting to help and improve things and make things better and ultimately bring out more equity, equality, and resourcing. I felt that the inequity of resources around the globe, it just really weighed heavy on my heart. And of course, even for myself personally, I've had, a whole healing journey with different things. So when I got to a point of deciding, well, what am I going to do with this? Like, I've been studying all these things. Where do I really want to end up? The ultimate answer just came back to, be the change where you are. And that's very North Node in Pisces. It's not
Mhm.
always about what you do, it's about who you are being. And
Mhm.
so, in order to be the best version of myself, I wanted to learn more about myself and really tune into, okay, how do I get to impact the people around me? It's kind of that, like, think globally, act locally, be the change where you are. And so it's been like a lot of different things sort of led one thing to the next. It was first astrology for myself, then it was astrology for friends and family. And then I had a really great friend, a great female friend who really validated it for me. Because up to that point, it was very, in the closet. And by this time, this was like 10, 12 years ago, where
Mhm.
astrology hadn't yet become what it is. It wasn't yet super popular. This was like pre-Instagram time.
Mhm.
So like I didn't even really know that there were these whole wide swaths of people and communities. Like I came from a small town and kind of stuck to my own groups, but it all kind of blossomed at that time. But the key factor for me was that it was relational and that it was about really seeing people, and especially seeing my friends, seeing women, and allowing them to see me. There was this, like, seeing each other for our gifts and getting to almost go straight to the point. Like I learned so much about myself in terms of my difficulties of having like shallow surface level conversations. Not that there's anything wrong with that, but I would feel like I didn't really know how to relate with people unless we were going to the deepest place possible.
Mhm.
And I learned later that that was my Venus in Scorpio.
Mhm. I have the same placement, so I totally relate to what you're saying.
Yeah. So it was like, this is the perfect way to use this deep desire within myself to know people, to be able to dive deep. I have Venus in my 7th house of relationships. I really wanted to connect with people and friends, and ultimately come out of this like isolation of like what I thought was going on in the world, but it was like from my own very limited perspective. I really just wanted to connect with people and create networks and community building. So in addition to becoming a yoga teacher and hosting women's circles and just being involved in a lot of different ways in community building, it all just kind of built upon each other of, okay, astrology is a language that we can all connect to understand our own healing journey, to come into this sovereignty, to connect with people, to understand ourselves and other people better. And then ultimately, where the feminine, I think, comes in has been cyclical living and the alchemy of all of these different interplaying factors. So, yeah, that's kind of a long way to describe, I think, my overall journey.
I love that. And I deeply relate to so much of what you shared because I feel the same way with astrology. Sometimes I like read my friends and family and it's like you're right, that Venus in Scorpio wants to go deep, it wants to go beyond the surface. And it's really, I love when you share a read or like you just interpret someone's chart and they feel so seen. I love that feeling like I'm able to see in them, but then they also feel validated in who they are. So much of what you're saying I deeply resonate with. And I wanted to, just for anyone who's like really new to astrology, maybe I'm sure there's a lot of people listening to this that maybe only know their what they consider their star sign, their sun sign, right? Um, what we're going to talk about today is deeper than that. Obviously, we're going to talk about some of these planets that represent or highlight a lot of our feminine essence. And so it's important that we look at our complete birth chart, our natal chart, in order to do that. So before we dive into the planets, I'd love to know just your interpretation. What are some of the benefits of people understanding their birth chart, getting to know it, learning, studying it? And what do you think is the most important reason why we should take time to do this work?
So I am an alchemist at heart. And even if you study alchemy, Alchemy 101 is as above, so below, as within, so without. I am a seer of signs, and I believe we all are. If you decode your dreams, if you understand animal symbolism, like, oh, I'm having a thought, and all of a sudden a coyote runs by, or a hummingbird comes near, or, I'm thinking about something, and all of a sudden the universe is starting to show me all of these signs about how I'm on the right track. It ultimately, I think, is very validating for our intuition, this awareness that we already know that we're connected to
Mm,
everything. And astrology is just another way to read those signs. It's really looking at, the thousands of years of observation and correlation of other people who have also spent time reading the signs and then making these inferences and these correlations. And so I believe we're all astrologers in, if we know where the moon is, if we have noticed the different amounts of sunlight versus darkness, there's all these very subtle nuances to life on Earth that when we watch them, we understand what they mean in a collective sense, but also in a personal sense. So
mm,
even just that very simple idea of like, oh, for me, I was born in December, and in the Northern Hemisphere, that's the winter. I know it's opposite for you, but that piece of alone, like, oh, I was born when there was very little light, and it was cold, and people were thinking about, even, in our collective DNA, like our ancestors would be thinking about how to gather and store resources for the winter and how to make those resources last. And like, what kind of beliefs did we need to have in order to maintain connection as a community? I'm a Sagittarius sun. So there were all of these factors collectively that led up to this interpretation of, oh, this is a big part of my purpose. I was born at this time because the great mother decided, oh, this being was needed in this space, in this time, to kind of offer her medicine. And so I feel the same way about animals and plants. Like, everything has a purpose. Everyone has a purpose. It's like part of the earth. So we're included in that. And I
Mhm.
think astrology, especially for those who are wanting to connect more with themselves, with their bodies, with their feminine essence, is a way to really honor and validate our innate knowing of cycles. You know, we understand the seasons, we understand the moon cycles, and we understand our own physical body hormonal cycles, and we're part of that. We're not separate from it. And I think of it as this doorway to reclamation of our truth and our nature and who we are. So there's a lot more I could say about that, that I'd love to hear from you.
Yeah, I love that. It's so true. And I love the nuances that you speak of around just being born at winter time or in summertime, like how even just something so simple, I wouldn't even think about that type of thing and how that can represent so much. It's so true. Where was the moon placed? It's like, even in just the most simplistic way, that can allude to so much of how we, I suppose, express ourselves in this lifetime and what we're here to do and help people with. And I love so much of what you share about being on purpose. That is 100% what I see with the birth chart and birth chart readings. It's like seeing people light up because it's like, oh, I'm actually designed perfectly like this, like I'm meant to be how I am. And I think there's so many things in our world which are telling us, no, be like this, or you should strive to be this. But actually, astrology kind of makes you feel, for me, it was like validating, like, no, you are perfect as you are. Actually, it's not the world that you need to strive to be to compete with this world at large. It's like, no, coming back to yourself, returning to who you are, often who we were as children, right? Like these things that we were interested in, what we naturally gravitated towards. I find astrology is very much this coming home. So thank you so much for explaining that. And now I want to dive into talking more specifically of the feminine and how we can use our birth charts to understand our unique feminine essence. So maybe you want to walk us through some of the planets and how they express and how we can kind of learn to read those in our charts.
Absolutely. You touched on something so perfect with our coming home to self and that reclamation, because it links directly to the moon. And so the moon being the closest celestial body to Earth, the moon is the most universal, even in all of the different kinds of astrologies out there. You know, there's the Western astrology, Vedic astrology, Chinese, Mayan, like every culture has their own form of reading the patterns and their own way of decoding everything. But everybody can agree that the moon is primal to who we are. It's said that the moon is the only guarantee. The moon in our birth charts is the only certainty because the moon is what we already are. In shamanic astrology, the moon is what we've already mastered in past lives. So I always refer
Mm,
to the moon as our medicine, and that's the mother energy, but how we really are these ambassadors of this wisdom. So when we're children, we tend to really actually embody our moon sign a lot more than our sun
mm,
sign. And that's especially true, you know, up to puberty times. And then we start to explore that and challenge that. And it's again all about that self-image because the moon is the reflector. She shows us really what's happening. She's also the communicator and the satellite, but almost like a messenger or a beacon, or the way that all of the other planets' energies come down to Earth. It all comes through the moon. And it's almost that the more we are able to be validated for who we are, and again, going back to that inner child, these essential qualities, once we're able to validate that, then all of these other aspects of self become available. It's said that when we are seen for our moon and we're seen for ourselves, and then we're able to be more experimental, we're able to almost play with these other archetypes in the chart a lot more. So moon is mother, and that doesn't always mean like it's a direct reflection of who your mother is, but it's
mm,
oftentimes your relationship with your mother and perhaps how you needed to be nourished and nurtured. And the moon has so much to do with safety. and security, and how do we feel safe in ourselves? And I think that is one of the most important conversations for women, especially, and anybody who's on a path of reclaiming sovereignty, rewilding, connecting with our feminine essence, because when we feel safe, we can do anything. When we feel safe, we can create. When we feel safe, we can play. When we feel safe, we can initiate and attract what we need. And that's, I think, the that's when we know that we've healed, or we are in that place of wholeness, because we just feel safe to be who we are. So we can look at our moon, where it is by sign and by house, just to feel into what makes me feel safe. So like my example, and I have an Aquarius moon, but you can kind of think about it elementally. Aquarius is an air sign. And even if you're new to astrology, even just breaking everything down into the elements can be
Mm-hmm.
so helpful, because it's so intuitive. Like when we think of fire, we think of, creativity and like starting things and initiation. When we think of air, we think of ideas and logic and conversation and learning. When we think of earth, we think of our bodies and being really physical and grounded. And when we think of water, we think of emotion. So that is true in astrology. So
Mm-hmm.
it's super easy to connect with that. So if you even just look at your moon sign, what's the element? And doing any activity that's associated with that element is often your path to safety. And it's often your
Mm.
path to mastery as well. So for me, moon in Aquarius, it's like if I'm feeling stressed or like outside of myself, I really benefit from reading a book or talking things out with people, or even like meditating, because there's like that association with the Akashic records with Aquarius. So it could be really simple. And then now all of a sudden, just by
Mm-hmm.
me engaging in those activities, I'm tapping into my thread of divine feminine power, because that's my medicine, that's my mastery.
Mm, I love that. Yeah, I can totally relate to what you're saying. I'm actually a moon Leo, so at the moment I'm loving this Leo energy, and it's completely different to you. Like what makes me feel safe and nurtured is connecting to my inner child, and play is a big part for me. Creativity, oh my gosh, like I need to create. It's like it's part of who I am. Like I have that fire, like you're saying, the passion, the creativity. It's that nurtures me on some way. I think as a kid I would always play a lot. Kind of I don't know if it was like an escapism, but like it was like my default. Like I would just go into my room with my toys and I would just create like a magical fantasy realm where I would just like, that was what nurtured me. And that I feel like ties in with that Leo imagination and play, and the creativity aspect. So, yeah, I love that. And I totally see how that's another example for anyone listening, how it's just very different for each of us. And just looking at the element, like you said, can just highlight so much.
Absolutely. And even going and spending time with that element. Like if you have a water moon, physically getting in water. If you have an earth moon, and I actually think this is good for everybody, earthing, bare feet on the earth, but especially
Mm-hmm.
for earth moons, it's almost like you'll be even more sensitive to things if you're not connected to the earth as a moon earth sign. So once that moon is validated, now you get to go and explore and play and like add on. It's like everything else is a bonus. And
Mm-hmm.
I love that, thinking about things in terms of, like everybody always comes to astrology wanting to know their purpose. And I think it's so important as a reminder, like your purpose was fulfilled the moment that you were born. And
Mm-hmm.
everything else that you do in this life is bonus. And yes, there will be these really important things that are, for you to express and for you to just share. But there's a point of just kind of letting it come naturally and not feel like there's got to be all this striving and forcing and like pressuring ourselves to express a certain way. And oftentimes the moon is going to be that most natural, easy, like serving from overflow kind of space. So that can be really helpful, I think, for women, because we often want to give. That's just a big part of our nature. We hold the relational caliber of
Mm-hmm.
all of our different relationship dynamics, and knowing our moon sign can really help us honor, like, this is what I have to give relationally and emotionally, this is what I have space for. It can also help us understand our boundaries and our availability, and um, what is energy giving, like life giving, and what is energy draining too. So that's
Mm.
really important.
Oh
And then,
yeah.
and yeah, go ahead.
Oh no, I was just going to say I see that so much even just with the work I do. So many women have this tendency to overgive, particularly mothers. It's, this natural, it comes from a good place. It comes from this place, yeah, I want to take care, I want to nurture. But I see so many women, and I saw this with my mom, just completely depleted because they're not filling up their own tank. And so I think it's so important to really learn about the moon. How do you feel nurtured? And making it a priority to give to yourself. And from that place, then we overflow, and then we can be better nurturers, or mothers. We have the capacity to give more because we are full. So that's so important, I think, for so many women to hear.
Absolutely. And I am a big fan. So if I'm doing a reading or teaching or anything, I am such a big fan of knowing what your reliable sources are. Like, so what are the things that you can do that you know are going to fill your well? So making a list of those, and then maybe checking out your moon sign and like seeing what are the connections there. That could be a really fun sort of self-inquiry activity. And even
Mm.
thinking about it in terms of the moon phase and cyclical awareness, were you born near a new moon or a full moon? And very basically, it's like, what quality of light is accessible to you? Does your medicine shine in the brightness in terms of like full moon energy, or does your medicine shine in the dark? Even
Mm.
something like that, or somewhere in between. So there's a lot of different ways that it comes, and it's not just, one right way of expression, which I think is really important when coming to astrology, because it could be so tempting to just
Mhm.
look online and like see everybody's interpretations and then make all of these assumptions about yourself and feel like, oh, this is what I should be. This is how I should act. And
Mhm.
so it's, you always want to kind of have that discernment up when you're reading about other people's experiences or reading astrology interpretations, because they're valid for that person's
Mhm.
perception. So you have your own, way of seeing yourself. It's kind of like take what resonates and leave the rest.
And even just how the whole chart plays in with one another. There's once you take in all the aspects, and I know this is like moving beyond the basic beginner level, but it's so complicated. It's so much more than what most people think it is. Like it's very hard, exactly what you're saying about making like a cookie cutter. This is the interpretation of this moon in Taurus in the fifth house, whatever. You can't depict it as one interpretation. There's so many different interpretations, and I think it's really what you're saying about listening to your intuition, what resonates for you. That's going to be the biggest, the most important thing when understanding your chart, because you know yourself best. It's not for someone else to tell you. It's like you know this deep down.
Mhm. And something else about the moon is she is our journey of integration. So between our past, present, and future versions of self. And that kind of brings us into the maiden, mother, crone, triple
Mm.
goddess energy. And so we're actually all of those versions of ourselves kind of all at once. If you tune
Mm-hmm.
into the quantum physics idea, like everything's already happening.
Yeah.
So we often look back and do the inner child healing work, and really making sure that our inner child feels safe and has a seat at the table in the present moment. But then I think something that's really helpful too with the moon is to tune into your inner elder, your inner wise grandmother, and bring her into present time too, because it just gives us a nice glimpse of, well, like, what does the future hold for me in terms of like what I'm becoming, almost tuning into like an acorn in an oak tree. Everything that the acorn needs to become an oak tree is already there. It's just that you're going to be at a different stage of unfolding. So all of this is part of astrology. And something else that's important too, every planet almost has like a beacon of energy, and the planets talk to each other. So when you start to tune into like, well, what is Jupiter doing when
Mm,
Jupiter is connected to the moon? Or what about Mars or Saturn or Mercury? Like they're all going to have a different contribution to
mm,
your self-image and how you integrate and know yourself. And so another really important planet for understanding our feminine essence is Venus. So you ready to talk about Venus?
yeah, let's go.
All right. So it said that once we feel clear and validated in our moon, we can start to experiment and explore with Venus. And Venus, from my view, is our creative initiation journey. She's really how we are becoming that expression of the divine feminine. She's our emergent divine feminine. So this is already really interesting. Now we have two points of data to reference about ourselves. We have this like moon as medicine, like how we
Mhm,
came in. This is like natural. This is like super anchored and grounded about us. And then we have this like opportunity with Venus
mm,
to unpack like what are these other ways that I can magnetize, that I can attract, that I can tune into my desire and my pleasure and my capacity to influence and create and co-create. She's that co-creative um, planet that she's always reminding us that yes, there's who we are and what we want as individuals, but there's always going to be that other, whether that other is a person, a romantic partner or a child or a parent or a boss or the world at large. She's kind of reminding us that in order to have this fulfillment in life, this creative fulfillment, that there are a lot of other people and other points of reference involved. And so the sign that we have our Venus in is going to show our experience of how we relate with others and therefore how we create, because all creation is fluid and dynamic. And so we're
mhm,
never just creating by ourselves. It
mm,
always has another point of reference. So she gives us so much information. So based on the cycle, the Venus cycle that we're part of, and if anybody is curious and wants to learn more about that, I have a free intro to the Venus cycles mini course that's available to everyone. And I can give you those links for people to
mm,
sign up who are feeling called to that. So there's the Venus cycle we're born into, there's the Venus natal placement that we're born into. And all of this, it really gives us this direction and pathway of these are going to be the challenges in a relationship. These are going to be the power that you can deepen into and really understanding your magnetism. So I'm a big fan of following what's juicy
mhm,
and, letting it be easy. That's actually one of Venus's mantras because we tend to think like, okay, if it's too easy, that must mean we're like cheating. This
mhm.
is not the right thing. And in some cases, if we're talking about Saturn, maybe that's what Saturn would have to say about
Yep.
something. Because Saturn's about discipline and dedication and hard work, and there's like a right way to do things and there's a path. But Venus is more like, well, no, like, does it smell good? Does
Mm,
it taste good? If it's good, then I want it.
mhm,
And I could just make decisions from that place. So she's about that inner harmony as well as outer harmony and really listening to our senses, becoming more embodied, because the more embodied we are, the more we have that capacity to make these aligned, intuitive decisions about what our next yes will be. It's all about following our bliss ultimately.
mm, And so maybe, so if we're looking at our Venus, for those that are new, would it be a good place to start with the elements again?
Absolutely. Yes.
Mm,
And I would actually back up a little bit and talk about the signs that Venus naturally rules or
mhm,
hosts. Rulership is like the ancient way that astrologers have spoken about affinity between planets and signs, but sometimes it gives this interesting, like hierarchical, better than, worse than
mhm,
dichotomy if we start to use words like rulership. But it can be helpful for learning. But what she has affinity for and who she hosts. So her two hosting signs are Taurus and Libra.
Mhm.
And Taurus is that inner cultivation, that earth sign that's really, uh, I alluded to this earlier, connected to senses, knows what feels good in the body, is very much about grounding and tuning into that sense of personal security, even the material world. Like, how do we relate with abundance? Venus also has that connection with money and
Mm,
marketing, and like, how do we put ourselves out there? What's our image? These are all kind of Venusian qualities. So our capacity to really feel into our own beauty and our own
mhm,
worth, these are
mm,
all Taurian themes as well. And then if we look at Libra, this is the more co-creative relational theme, but Libra has a lot to do with helping other people feel beautiful as well, because Libra
mm,
has a lot of connection to that co-creative aspect and being seen. And it's almost like, do I even know who I am if I don't understand, if I'm not being seen?
mm,
So Venus wants to be seen, she wants to be beautiful. And so that as a baseline, and then you add on the sign that your
mhm,
Venus is in. But Venus is going to be Venus no matter what
mm,
sign she's in. Like, so you and I, the
mm,
Venus in Scorpio.
mhm.
Scorpio is associated with like the femme fatale and it's like dark power and this reclamation and transformation energy and like doing the shadow work. And those are not
Mhm,
typically like always 100% traditionally beautiful spaces. Like, you actually kind of get to the ugly places to really tune into radical emotional honesty that requires vulnerability. It's actually a very intimate place, but it's not like the Scorpio energy itself is not about what is traditionally beautiful. It's actually
mm,
about finding beauty and the beauty of the process, the beauty of alchemy, the beauty of transformation that actually accepts the whole cycle: birth, life, and death, and rebirth. So tuning into that for you, if you have Venus in one of the earth signs, Taurus, Virgo, Capricorn, a lot of the ways that you are learning how to really own your beauty and own your worth is going to have to do with the physical world.
mm,
So a lot of times there's this co-creation that is centering around resources. And that's really good to know, because then you can feel into like, this is how I am most magnetic when
mm,
whether it's dressing like your Venus or connecting with these are things I can learn about. If you have Venus in an air sign, a lot of times it has to do with reading, learning, studying, being a messenger, communicating, really mastering this harmonious communication, this um, language that helps you to connect with more people with Venus in an air sign. If you have Venus in a fire sign, there's a lot more of that mastering of your own spontaneity, trusting your instincts, your impulses, your creative connection with source, because fire has to do with the spirit and ether and intuition. And it's different than water intuition. So
mhm,
if you have Venus in a water sign, being, Scorpio, like we talked about, or
mhm,
Cancer or Pisces, these are a lot more empathic and sensitive and just feeling all of the different things that there are to be felt, whether that's feeling other people really intensely and then understanding, oh, how do I alchemize those feelings of others? Like, a lot of times Venus in a water sign is the sign of an empath, and really
mm,
learning how to master that and work with that and have healthy boundaries around all of
mhm.
that. I know that's a big one for me.
Oh, me too. Story of my life,
Yeah.
really.
Yeah. Well, it's, if you have a water sign Venus, you literally can take on the energy of others. So it's like Venus and Cancer, for example, like we were talking about the moon, and the moon is the host of the sign of Cancer. So we can think of, traditional themes that affect motherhood, and, this desire to give, and sometimes the pitfalls of like, well, am I enabling? Am I, making this more difficult for them by, giving them everything they need without empowering them to do it for themselves? Those kind of things. It's really because Venus in a water sign can intuit somebody else's needs before they're even asking. And
Mm,
so then the journey becomes, well, how do I want to create with that? I mean, ultimately, it's about finding the point of power for you and not feeling beholden to things like, oh, if I have Venus in Cancer, that means I have to just always be taking care of people. or something
Mm.
like that. It's more like, how do I want to take care of people? What is the
Mm.
most magnetic, juicy, personally fulfilling as well, like including ourselves in that
Yeah, I was going to
harmonization.
say, even just how do I want to be nurtured? That could be, I
Yeah.
see that a lot with people with the Cancer Venus. It's putting that attention. It's like not just giving to others, but how do I feel nurtured? Again, coming back to that overflow.
Yes. And it's complex because, I mean, not to go too deep into the history of the world that we live
Mhm.
in, but it's pretty new in our culture, in our society, to really ask what we need and to talk
Mm.
about our needs and to talk about our values, especially as women. There wasn't that long ago that that was not a thing. And so even I work with women who are in older generations, and I ask them, like, what do you want?
Mm.
And what are your needs? And they're like, nobody's ever asked me that question. And
Wow.
I have no idea how to answer that. And so Venus and how we relate with our natal Venus is a lot of that, reconnecting with our needs and wants, and not seeing it as selfish, and kind of
Mm.
putting yourself first in certain ways. And realizing that when we do that, that's actually when we are most magnetic, because what benefits us actually benefits everybody around
Mm.
us.
Mm. Beautiful. Is there any other placements we should look at?
So there are the goddess asteroids, and
Hmm.
they are really helpful for tuning into different elements of the feminine journey. So we can look at Black Moon Lilith, who's
Mm.
actually both a mathematical point and an asteroid. There are a couple different Liliths, and she's all about reclaiming the shadow. So where we have Lilith really shows us like this is the part of the feminine that maybe is really actually quite difficult for us included. Like,
Mhm.
how do we want to express that energy? But it's an important part of our rewilding journey and our reclamation journey. If we look at Ceres, she kind of works with the moon, has similar affinity to the moon. She shows us a lot about how we are as a mother or a nurturer. She's our nurturing language, and also how we need to be nurtured as well. She tends to also show us our relationship with cycles and hormones and understanding just the different cycles throughout life, loss, grief, wisdom. She's really part of that great mother archetype. And so she is really an important guide as well. When we look at, say, kind of triangulating between like moon and Ceres and any other points connected to them, we can start to see, oh, like this is a really big part of how I nurture. You can kind of combine those
Mm.
things. The asteroids, I think, are really helpful. And there are a few more that we could talk about. But I also think, especially if you're coming to astrology, and it can tend to get a little bit overwhelming when you add in a
Mm.
lot, the asteroids are always kind of secondary to the planets. Like I'm a proponent of, the first seven planets are the most important. And then you go to Uranus, Neptune, and Pluto for those more generational aspects, and kind of to show the general culture that we were born into. But it's almost like the asteroids should support what you already see
Mhm.
with the main seven planets. But if we look at the moon, also knowing the moon's south node and north node, which again are mathematical points, that there's a whole bunch I can say about that.
Mhm.
Um, but the most basic is kind of how I mentioned before, with the moon being our path of integration between past, present, and future versions of self. That's really what the nodal axis is, the south node and the north node. It's kind of like past and future. And what are my gifts? What have I already been really involved in? And then what am I evolving into? Who am I becoming? How do I get to explore what's outside of my typical comfort zone? And from that, exploration, find new forms of validation, new forms of self-expression. And so all of that is going to be really tied into the feminine as well, because they're moons, the
Mm.
moon's nodes. But I would say particularly Moon, Venus, the goddess asteroids, and anything that's connected to them.
Mm.
And so there are a few other points in the chart that are not planets, but they are the angles. So the eastern horizon, the ascendant. A lot of people, like when you're coming to astrology, you tend to learn about like sun, moon,
Yeah.
rising. Well, the rising is the same as the ascendant. And the
Yeah.
rising, I think, is really important too for the feminine journey. And because it's about our bodies, it's about
Yeah.
like this is how we walk the beauty way, as I like to call it. Like this is how we actually define our environment and understand where we are in time and space. And that's central to the feminine journey because it's very much about being grounded in the here and now and really listening. So when you combine the moon and the rising sign together,
Hmm.
that can give you a lot of information as well around how do you show up most authentically.
Mm. Yeah, I love that. I hadn't thought about the ascendant being connected to the feminine, but you're right. It's especially if you want to have a conversation about embodiment, how does it express through you, then yeah, definitely taking into consideration the rising. Mm. So if someone's learning about all of these different aspects and planets, and what do you think are some tangible ways that they can integrate all of this into their daily lives? Like, do you have any, I don't know, suggestions on some practical ways that they can take this knowledge and actually apply it in, the 3D?
Hmm. So I think first and foremost, actually going outside and just spending time with the moon
Mm,
and really observing her in all of her phases and connecting it, comparing it with your own experience. Like, oh, how am I actually feeling when the moon is here in this sign or in this phase? And how does that relate to my own natal moon? And that's where I think most of the alchemy happens. And we don't always have to be, using new moons or full moons to like manifest something specific or, like have a really clear intention or goal, because sometimes we don't. Like sometimes
mm,
we're just kind of in the present moment and kind of seeing what comes up. And I think that is a really great way to just observe
mhm,
and remember, recapitulate, like do your journaling and ask other people around you, like, how are you feeling? And how's this
mm,
influencing you? And then if you want to compare that with what you're seeing about their chart, you can
mhm,
really do so much with the moon. I think that's what I recommend to every one of my students and clients who are really wanting to learn how to embrace astrology and in both the, mental, intellectual sense, but also
mm,
this grounded, really felt and embodied sense. And actually
mm,
going out and like receiving the moonlight on your face.
mhm,
If you work with crystals, at the full moon, like get
mhm,
your crystals out and charge them, like do rituals with the moon. And it's not about having this like expectation, like, oh, if I do this, something really specific is going to happen. I think more than anything, it's just about honoring that, like, wow, this
mhm,
is happening and I am participating in it.
mhm,
And I'm curious about what else will come when I continue to participate because, and it also, that act alone, I think it invites the spirit realm, your plant allies, your animal allies, your
mhm,
spirit guides, your God, goddess, however you connect with the world of spirit, it invites it closer.
mhm.
It's almost like your guides are like noticing, like, oh, she's paying attention. Like, let's give her things. Yeah. Like dropping in more signs, dropping in those downloads. And I think being really curious and playful is the best. And same with Venus. Like right now, she's an evening star. So we can actually go out after sunset and in the Western horizon, after the sun sets, you can find Venus as the evening
Mm,
star. She's usually that bright, shiny one that you'll see, maybe up to a couple hours after the sunset. And so same thing, like making your wishes, like speaking out loud your goals, your dreams, your desires, your intentions, and just asking, like, how can I connect with you? And really just listening in that moment, like what comes up. And then again, doing your contrasting, comparing with, if you're
mm,
looking on apps or something, like where's Venus right now? And how does that connect with my natal Venus? So it's always, anytime I'm working with a planet, I'm always looking at, okay, so say right now Venus is in Virgo and connecting with the moon. And so Venus is having her whole like Virgoan experience right now. But how does Venus and Virgo relate with Venus and Scorpio, which is my natal
mm,
Venus? Like always looking at both
mhm.
and never just like saying, oh, it's just this one thing. Because
Yep.
there's always going to be like, how does that transiting planet influence you as an individual. And just the more we watch, the more we pay attention. And even if you are extra ambitious, like go back in time and actually
Mhm.
look at where Venus was at,
Mhm.
last year when you were going through a breakup or getting into a new relationship, or you had this really amazing idea, or you felt really like alive and in flow and inspired, like do your best to mark those things and see like, well, what were the planets doing? And that can just help you to know like when this energy is going to come back, because it always does. I mean, in
Mhm.
most cases, when we're talking about the personal planets, we're going to have all of the personal planets, like Venus, for example, she'll take 19 months to go through all the signs. So these are like um, timelines that we can actually follow,
Mhm.
and we can reference and we can look at, see like what part of this cycle tends to be more flowing for me, which part of this cycle tends to be more challenging,
Mm.
and looking at it that way. And then you can kind of prepare yourself if you're seeing, similar
Mm.
patterns coming up in the future.
Mm. Yeah, I love that. Thank you for sharing. I definitely know for me, connecting to the moon has been such a big part of my reclamation of the feminine, just even getting in tune with the cycles. And that's connected me to my own cycle, my menstrual cycle. And, I track my menstrual cycle and seeing where the moon's at and how that influences one another and doing rituals, like you say, and just getting in flow with that, I felt has connected me so deeply with my own feminine essence. So that's amazing, everything you've just shared. And yeah, it deeply resonates with me.
And
So,
that's what it's all about. It's that resonance. Like
mm,
there's something I think really important with the with tracking our cycles and paying attention to all of these patterns is, where do you feel these like points of resonance? This is a fun fact I just wanted to drop in for everyone. If you are trying to conceive,
mhm,
you're you're following your hormonal cycles, you're following your fertility cycles, and then you want to kind of bring astrology in, it is so helpful to know the phase of the moon that you're born under,
mm,
because that has resonance. It's almost like when you strike a tuning fork and there's another tuning fork that is tuned to the same frequency, it will also start sounding. So you can kind of think of our bodies like that with the transits, so that um, that resonance between, where the moon is in the sky and your own phase, your body, your fertility actually turns on. So even if that's outside of when you might be typically ovulating, this is kind of where you see those like surprise pregnancies, or like, oh,
mm.
I didn't know I could get pregnant at this time. So that is just another fun fact. This is where you really can see it very practically apply.
Wow. No, I didn't know that.
Yeah.
That's so
Amazing.
interesting.
Yeah. So anybody
Mm.
trying to get pregnant or
There you go.
trying to
You
not
heard
get
it here.
pregnant?
Oh, wow. This has been amazing. I've loved this conversation. I could keep going, but I know that we have, time that we're sticking by. So, my final question to you, and this is something I ask all my guests on the podcast, is because you are on the Thank Goddess podcast, this podcast is about awakening goddess consciousness within ourselves and on the planet. And for me, the way that I explain goddess consciousness is, connecting to our hearts. And I suppose connecting to the essence of our moon, our Venus, and how that expresses through us, through our authenticity. So, my final question is, when do you feel most aligned with the goddess or goddess consciousness?
Mm, I love that question so much. And when you asked it, my whole body kind of erupted in these truth bumps just
Mm,
everywhere. And that always happens when I know we've like struck a chord that's really important. That is truth. And honestly, I think bringing that question to the forefront of the conversation as often as possible is so important. So
mm,
I feel that the most when I'm getting into my body. I mean, I know for me, my breath work, my yoga, my sitting outside, that's when I feel the most connected. And that's how I know that I can always return. Like we kind of brought it up earlier in our conversation, like what are your reliable sources for how you refill the well? And
mhm.
I think of refilling the well as just that reminder of our essence and who we really are. Like, thank goddess that we have all of these many reminders. And
Mm,
It's ultimately just about getting the best I can into present time consciousness.
Mm, I love that and deeply relate. And so, finally, where can people find you? If you have any offers that you want to share with my listeners, feel free.
Of course. So I mentioned that free Venus cycle mini course, and I also have a another free course. It's called Cosmic Creativity Guides. It's a little bit more nuanced and in depth than the Venus course, and that's you can find both of those at nurarachelle.com, and I'll give you some more specific links. But I also primarily do one-on-one coaching sessions, both like one-time sessions which are really fun. But I would say my favorite work is the where I get to really help people work through, creative projects and this deeper reclamation and application and really integrating astrology into our lives. It's one thing to take in all this information and it can be really fun and exciting and validating and you feel really seen. And then for most people, the next question is like, how do I live this? How do I apply it? So I'm just a big fan of being a companion and a guide through that application and integration part of the journey. And that's really where the sweet spot of transformation and alchemy really comes in. So I have a program called Rebel Reborn, which is where we do most of that work. And I'm also on Instagram at Nura Rachelle and posting all sorts of different fun things there. And I have a YouTube channel as well, Nura Rachelle Astrology. So I'm easy to find. Really, all of my things are just Nura Rachelle, just to keep it easy.
Mm, thank you. And I'll share all of that in the show notes, all your links, so people can find you. Thank you once again. This conversation has been so interesting. And I've personally learned so much. And I hope everyone listening has really taken away some of these gems that you've shared today. So I really appreciate the work that you're doing and sharing all your wisdom with us. So thank you. Thank you once again.
Oh, thank you so much for having me, Danielle. You're a beautiful soul. And I just love this conversation. I really believe that these are the most important conversations of our time because this is how we bring more soul and beauty and love into the world. Thank
Mm.
you.